So, Joseph Humphrey Sloss. He was a lawyer, a representative in the Illinois State Senate, a major in Alabama's Confederate Cavalry during the American Civil War, a mayor of Tuscumbia, a real estate and loan broker, an insurance salesman, U.S. Congressman for Alabama's 6th District, a U.S. Marshal, a U.S. Commissioner, co-proprietor of a printing office, and a newspaper editor for at least one Illinois paper and also for several Alabama papers. So he was a very enterprising little guy. So he was born on October 12, 1826 in Summerville, Alabama to his parents, Reverend James L. and Letitia Campbell Sloss. After finishing his general studies under his father, Joseph Sloss went on to study law and was admitted to the bar at the age of 18. He began his legal career by practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri for approximately 4 years, followed by his move to Edwardsville, Illinois in 1849, where he continued his practice. While living in Edwardsville, he married his wife, Mary L. Lusk, and the couple would have 5 children. Sloss was a captain in the Illinois Militia Company, a captain of the Illinois Militia Company named the Madison Guards, which was organized around 1857. Sloss was no longer on the roster by April 25, 1861. And it's interesting, he served in the Illinois State Legislature from 1858 to 1859 as a member of the Know Nothing Party. I've always loved the name of that party. He left for North Alabama in the opening days of the Civil War. So his service records are pretty nondescript in and of themselves. These come from the National Archives, of course. They're on Fold 3. He began his service as a captain and ended with the rank of major. And on the second one over here, you see that he is on special duty in North Alabama. So to the best of my understanding from other records I found, this is when he was assigned to do recruitment work in Tuscumbia. So from what I can find, he really didn't serve in the thick of battle in most cases, if any. He spent most of the war doing things like recruiting work, being part of the judge advocate staff. So he did end with the rank of major, and he served in Company F and enlisted in Florence on September 15th, 1862 for 3 years or war. So Roddy is just honestly someone I'm starting to get into. I have recently gotten a little expose from his wife that his wife wrote, or the one that he left. The one who wrote a book. So I just recently got that and haven't had a chance to go through it yet, but I know it's going to be a trip. So it's not really a surprise that Roddy was endorsing Sloss, no matter how Sloss was behaving or would later behave. He was Sloss's commanding officer, and this letter right here makes it very clear that he was impressed with Sloss. It asked for the appointment of Captain Joseph H. Sloss as a member of Military Court of North Alabama. And in this letter, Roddy wrote, "If a military court shall be assigned to my command, I would respectfully suggest that Captain Joseph H. Sloss, Company F, 4th Alabama Cavalry Regiment, Roddy's Brigade, be appointed a member thereof. He is about 40 years old, a lawyer of considerable experience, has been in my command since September 1862, is captain of said company. I believe him fully qualified for that position, and as such that he would be more valuable to the service than in the line. He was a native citizen of Alabama until some years ago. He moved to Illinois to practice his profession, but upon the breakout of hostilities, he returned to Alabama, bringing with him a number of soldiers who are in our service." In November 1864, Sloss was serving as General Roddy's temporary judge advocate of the military court. This first record shows that Sloss had been in the Confederate service since September 14, 1862. The second record is where things get interesting. This letter is in a separate collection from his service records on Fold 3 called the Union Citizen Files. And if I had not essentially been going through every single collection on Fold 3 looking for his name, I would have never found this, because why would you look for a Confederate officer in the Union citizen files? However, this is where he was. In brief, this letter says, send Joseph Sloss, a prisoner now in confinement at Paducah, Kentucky, to this office as soon as possible, by command of General Thomas. This is interesting because none of his service records mention him being captured. This final record here shows that Sloss took the oath of allegiance on May 19th after supposedly surrendering on May 1st. This record notes his place of residence as being Franklin County and describes him as having a dark complexion with black hair and hazel eyes, and that he stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. I found conflicting things about where he left the war, because this says that he surrendered in Florence. But he was not in Florence at the time that this record is dated, because he was busy being captured. This led me on one heck of a wild goose chase for a bit, because I didn't know, I had the regular listing of his records. I didn't have this Union citizen file initially. And so it just says that, he was a good little soldier, and he, mustered out in Florence, which, makes sense relatively. So then you get into the story. And I think I'm going to depart from the PowerPoint just a bit here, because I'd rather go in the order, I think, of how I figured this out. I'm going through newspaper articles. I've looked at his Civil War service records. I'm not finding anything of particular note. And I'm going through newspaper articles, and I'm finding, not only did he shoot his future son-in-law, which is a whole nother story, and not only did he do a number of other things that were ill-advised, but he gets into an argument with J.B. Moore. And Joshua Burns Moore was a lawyer here in Tuscumbia. And what's so funny is that when Sloss shot his future son-in-law, Moore was his legal representative, which is ironic when, about 2.5 years down the road, they're having this argument in the newspapers. So both of them were politicians, Moore and Sloss, at this point. And Moore had been at a public meeting and made some comments about so-called independence, because at this point, Sloss was trying to run for another term in office. He had not got the Democratic Party nomination, and so he was running as an independent, and Moore didn't appreciate that. He didn't appreciate that at all. And so he got up in a meeting and made some comments, but he didn't actually mention Sloss by name. Sloss had a paper which unfortunately is mostly missing from record. But thankfully, the stories got picked up by other newspapers that do still exist. So there's some gaps in places because his paper doesn't have his exact response to give us, but other papers picked up the story, and so that's mostly what we have here. They started arguing. They started going back and forth because, Moore said this, and then Sloss wrote a letter saying that Moore was a horrible, terrible liar and excuse of a person. And then Moore wrote back saying, I didn't call him by name, but if he wanted to apply these statements to himself, then let's go ahead and talk about his record. Moore had not served in the Civil War himself. I'm torn between thinking he was a Unionist and basically just wanted to stay the heck out of everything. I think he was more a self-preservationist than a Unionist. But he did not serve in the Civil War, and I think he did have a number of health issues, so take that as you will. But this argument starts in the papers, very public argument. So you have, in January of 1874, the Florence Times-Journal, the editor of that paper was talking about Sloss, and this is the important part of the article. It says, this is the identical Sloss who in the early part of the late war confiscated the property of some of the citizens of Lauderdale County because of their supposed disloyalty to the Confederacy or for some other cause. This is the same Major Joseph H. Sloss who later in the war deserted the Confederacy and went north on a federal gunboat. This is the same Sloss who after the war was engaged as a pardon broker, extorting money from his oppressed and poverty-stricken countrymen. This is the Sloss who, after his election to Congress by the Democracy, sold out to the radicals. This same Joseph H. Sloss is today in the Congress of the United States as the representative of the good people of the 6th Congressional District of Alabama, selling himself and his people to whoever will buy. They have a wonderful man, haven't they? So I had to dig to find that, because this next thing from May 25th, 1876, this is part of Moore's letter to the editor responding to Sloss's first attack. Because apparently, and I haven't been able to find Sloss's exact letter because that paper, I can't get my hands on copies of that paper. It seems like mostly they've been destroyed by time, I guess, and there weren't many years of them, so that doesn't help. But I don't have Sloss's exact words, but for his first response to Moore. But when Moore responds back, he said, Sloss's allusion to a fighting party comes with an ill grace from one who, in 1874, was publicly charged by a Florence editor with having deserted the Confederate cause and taken refuge on a Yankee gunboat. If Sloss ever denied the charge, I never heard of it. That led me to find this first article. That made me go back, this middle article made me go back and find this first one. And then that made me start looking back into the files and find this letter saying that he was a prisoner in Paducah. And I'm like, okay, when I found this, I started thinking that there might be some legitimacy to the story. Because, in a newspaper argument, it's like, yeah, maybe, but, is it just that they're angry, or is there actually something to this? So I wanted to find some proof that he had actually been captured, much less deserted. So this is proof that he was captured. And who he was captured by in the story are most fascinating. He was in the state legislature of Illinois with Colonel Moses M. Bain, who ends up being with the 50th Illinois Infantry. So this is all before the Civil War. They were friends. And he had been a member of the Illinois state legislature in the 1850s, friend of Sloss during this time. And Bain was going to be down in the Muscle Shoals area, and he wrote to Sloss inviting him to meet during his stay in Tuscumbia. Isn't that nice of him? Once aboard the Union gunboat, the captain would not allow Sloss to leave. Now, who could just look at this story and foresee that something was going to go wrong? This was late '64. So, and I think I've got some more about timeline and here in a moment. It's '64. Why you would think it was a good idea to meet someone from the other side, even if they told you, hey, you will be, as Bain was supposed to have told him, you will have safe passage, and, I just want to catch up for a little bit. Maybe meeting under some trees instead of going aboard the gunboat might have been an option. But no, Sloss goes aboard the Union gunboat. The captain wouldn't let him leave, and the story that we get is that Bain argued on behalf of Sloss, trying to trying to convince him to let Sloss leave, and the captain was like, no, I'm in charge of this vessel, and he's not going anywhere. He is a Confederate. So a few more details come out in the pension file that his widow ends up writing. First, she writes a letter right before he dies to a nephew of theirs, trying to get some ideas about how to file a pension, what state she needs to file. And she gives some details of his service. And she mentions in this letter, very importantly, I think I misspoke, it was 1865. She mentions that he was captured before the 4th Alabama Cavalry was surrendered and was taken prisoner at Florence and carried to Paducah. So she mentions that specifically in this letter, which provides some more details about the fact that he had been captured before the surrender came. She couldn't remember just how he had come out of the Army, so she didn't know some of the details, couldn't remember them, didn't want to remember them. But this does go through some of the details, saying that he was captured and made a prisoner. He was part of the 4th from the beginning of the war until captured, about 6 months prior to surrender. So that gives you a timeline of when that happened. It says that he was paroled at Nashville. So why is there the letter that says that he was paroled at Florence? I think it must just be kind of an accident of record keeping. But she was granted a pension, and it provides a few more details about his service, saying that, and also just about their lives, because it mentions when they were married and things like that aren't important for this story, but are interesting for research purposes. Yeah, and so this right here, this record on the far right says that he took his oath of allegiance at Nashville, not Florence. He took his oath in Nashville. He was captured, but he never got back to his unit, and that's something that's very annoying with some of the secondary sources that talk about it. Because some of them kind of try to indicate that he rejoined his unit and then they all surrendered and lived happily ever after. And that's not, I firmly believe, based on the records, that he was in Nashville when the others surrendered. And he was held in Kentucky for a while before he was allowed to go to Nashville, but he wasn't allowed to go any further south than Nashville until the surrender. Kind of to talk a little bit more about the whole Mora argument, the two of them continue to trade, all these different insults back and forth. Of course, his lack of service is used against J.B. Moore, and the supposed incident in the Florence Times-Journal is used against Sloss. Something I've been unable to find, just like the actual, first salvo from Sloss to Moore, is that Bain wrote essentially, and it would have been published in Sloss's paper. It's mentioned in other papers, but it's not quoted verbatim, which is very frustrating. Bain wrote essentially an affidavit saying that Sloss had not surrendered willingly. He had not deserted. It was not his fault. It was just all an unfortunate misunderstanding, and that Sloss had been a soldier who'd served his duty. Moore thought that was pretty ridiculous, that he, had the Bain write that for him. He didn't feel any differently afterwards. The Moulton Advertiser mentions their arguments going back and forth and says that J.B. Moore throws hot shot into J.H. Sloss, the salary grabber and the subsidy hero. Sloss has been guilty of so many mean things that it would fill a book to enumerate them, and disgraceful enough to make an honest man hide his face forever from the Anglo-Saxon race. And Sloss responded. There was thankfully one of the responses, there was a full listing of that in one of the papers. And Sloss responded to Moore that he had proved that Moore was a liar, that he had not deserted. As to his reference to salary grabber when he was in office as a representative of the United States who proved him to be a fool, and his conduct in the whole matter proves him the miserable coward. They go back and forth. They almost have a duel, but that's the thing, is it's an almost duel because they didn't intend to have a duel, so help me, they just wanted to like save face. So they both go to Memphis, and you see some headlines that talk about that Moore had tried to ambush him, that he had attempted assassination of an editor was the headline. The source for that specifically said that it was from a cable. And it didn't say who had sent the cable or where the cable was from. So my personal thought is that Sloss probably sent that or had that sent to make Moore look bad. But the truth of the matter is that Moore and Sloss would go to Memphis. They wouldn't shoot at each other, but there would be some of their friends that would write into the newspaper saying, like, we understand you have a little difficulty and we want to help you settle this amicably. And so they would. This right here, to me, is an excellent example of why we should be skeptical when we see a potential bad story or negative story about someone, because particularly when people are in politics, there's always mudslinging. But during the Civil War, as we probably all come across, there are inaccurate references, whether it's malicious intention or just propaganda or misinformation. I honestly figure this is just a nice little story, but it is funny. This is in the Philadelphia Inquirer, so this is from a Yankee newspaper, and it's telling the story of one rebel captain, Joseph Sloss, who was at the beginning of the war captain of Company I of the 9th Illinois. He lives in Florence and is the first lieutenant of his company, was willing to capture his old cap. So one of his former cadets was coming through Tuscumbia and wanted to capture him. He called at his house, but he had flown. His wife said he was eating dinner when the cannonading began, and soon after he left his house and the town in haste. I don't think the timeline is off. I don't think this is correct, but it is an interesting little anecdote. So do I think that he deserted it? Based on my research, there is no proof of his intentions. He did not have a journal, which is so... I would love to have seen his inner thoughts, because the ones that make it into the paper are great. It would have been political suicide, and as we've already seen, before the Civil War, Sloss was very much about appearance. He was very much interested in politics. He had abandoned Illinois to come to Alabama. He'd burned that bridge. He wasn't going to be able to get back into the Illinois state legislature. And if he had deserted, he wouldn't have been able to have had a good political standing after the war. So personally, based on his other behavior that you see throughout time, I don't think he was intending to desert. I think he was just dumb. And I think he didn't think it through, and he ended up on that gunboat and he was taken north because he was absolutely lacking in foresight, and a number of his other actions are absolutely lacking in foresight. When you get into his political career and how he spoke ill of other people who ran as independent candidates, and then he ends up running as an independent candidate, and they can go back to his editorials and literally quote them word for word, saying, hey, this is what you said about everybody else. Apply it to yourself. And there were a number of editors who did that, who would use his words against him. So in general, I do not think that he deserted, but I am still looking for any other discussion or any proof that might prove otherwise.